on a scale from 1 to 10, how often do you get into conversations with people that you don't know very well and hate what you're talking about? Like afterwards, you're like, why do we talk about that for 20 minutes? Why do we talk about that for 2 minutes? On the other hand, how many times on a scale from 1 to 10 do you get into a conversation with your friends where you hate what you're talking about? In this video, I'm going to share a quick policy that I've started to experiment with using that's helped me have better conversations with people, including my friends. So my guess is that when you talk to your friends, you talk about things that you enjoy talking about. If you like baseball, you probably talk with your friends about baseball. With people that you don't know very well, or people that you actively don't like, what ends up happening? You talk about things that you don't like to talk about. You talk about politics or something like that. Or maybe it's the reverse for you. Maybe you really like talking about politics and you don't like talking about baseball. Whatever the topics are, we tend to talk about the things we enjoy talking about with people that we like, our friends. And we tend to talk about things that we don't enjoy talking about with people that are strangers. So one thing I've been experimenting with recently is what I'm going to call an Antitopics policy. This is simply a list of topics that I know I typically don't enjoy talking about. For me, those are often the weather, sports, the news, especially when it's specific about like this murder that happened in Wisconsin somewhere. These, details, like maybe a war breaks out or something like that. Maybe there's some interest there for me. But in general, these little details of the news that don't affect me and don't make my life any better in any way. Anyway, I'll go off on a rant on all that. I don't like talking about those things. So I created a list that includes all of these topics. What's cool about having a list is that, number one, you identify what those topics are. Because a lot of times, for me anyway, I just kind of go through life having conversations with people, and then afterward I think back, I'm like, I didn't really enjoy that conversation very much. I'm like, well, why didn't I? It's like, oh, well, it happened to be one of these topics that I don't really tend to enjoy talking about. And so you pick up these themes. But if you're not intentional with thinking about, okay, what are the things that you don't like talking about, then you find yourself talking about these things all the time because other people like to talk about them, like the news or the weather or sports. These are big topics that a lot of people enjoy talking about. So setting down and writing a list of the things that you just don't really enjoy talking about can go a long way in crystallizing in your mind the things that you don't really enjoy talking about. The other part of this, though, is once you set them down, then when you get into conversations with people and we're talking about, let's say, the news, and I don't necessarily want to talk about the news, there's a couple things you can do. You either go along with the conversation and don't really enjoy it, which isn't great, or you ignore the conversation, you leave, and now you're not becoming closer friends or you're not really getting to know this person. Neither one is really a great option. Obviously, you can do those things, but wouldn't it be better if you could actually talk to this person about something that you both really enjoy, and maybe then you'd actually like that person more, instead of just writing them off as, well, they always want to talk about this topic that I don't like talking about. So what you can do when you create this list and you have this sort of policy in your mind, you're like, okay, well, I just know I don't really talk about these things that are on this list. And it doesn't have to be a list of 50 things. I'm talking about 2, 3, 4, 5, so topics. And when you get into a conversation with someone and it's one of these topics, you'll notice it as you're in the conversation, as opposed to just being afterward where you're like, oh, that was a waste of time after the fact. You can realize while you're in the conversation that, oh, this isn't actually a topic that I like talking about. So that awareness by itself is a huge benefit for me when I'm in conversations where I can realize in the moment while we're having the conversation that I'm not enjoying it. So then the next step is, okay, now I know that I don't enjoy it. I've made the list. Now I can do something about it. So like I said, there's a couple options. You could leave, you could just go on with the conversation, but ideally, a better strategy, I think, and what I'm trying to do, is turn the topic into something that I do enjoy. When somebody mentions the news, and I don't necessarily want to talk about that, what I can say is just mention my policy.
I'm sorry, I actually have this policy where I try not to talk about the news.
I would definitely recommend having a topic in mind to change it to, though. because you don't want to just shut down a conversation. What you want to do is redirect the conversation. So you say, hey, I have this policy. I don't like talking about this thing. Can we talk about such and such instead? And then the conversation can kind of move in that direction. Now, when you first start doing this, you're gonna feel a little bit awkward with it. I know I certainly am when I've tried this initially. But there's a couple things going on with this. Number one, by saying that it's a policy, it sort of offloads the personal conflict away from you. So who created the policy? Well, I did, right? But in the conversation, by saying it's a policy, instead of just saying, hey, I don't like talking about this, that seems very personal, very confrontational. By saying I have this policy, it sort of offloads the responsibility to the policy. Now we can talk about the policy and move on to a different conversation instead of it being as personal. Even still, when I've done this in conversations with people, it still creates a little bit of friction. So there's still a little bit of, well, friction there that you have to kind of overcome. What I've found is that it gets easier. The more I've used this phrase,
I have this policy,
the easier it is to do. The very first time it was super awkward. It kind of just ended the conversation. I almost didn't continue using this approach talking about the policy because I thought it might not work. But I continued with it and realized that, okay, I just needed to kind of perfect my wording. Frankly, I needed to feel more comfortable saying it. It didn't have so much to do with the other people in the conversation as much as it was me who needed to get over just saying, hey, I have this policy that I don't like to talk about the news. Can we talk about such and such instead? And also what I've realized is when I say I have this policy, a lot of times people will ask me about the policy. And I love talking about the policy. I love talking about how to talk about things and conversations and friendships and all of that, right? So it also actually creates its own little topic in there that we can sort of talk about for a couple minutes before we go into some other topic. So try that out, see if it helps you. I would love to see, if you try it, what seems to work and what doesn't. This is kind of a new thing for me. I've sort of had a policy in my mind for probably years at this point, but this is kind of new in terms of breaking it out and using it in a conversation and telling people like, hey, I have this policy about this. The last thing that I'll leave you with is this. The first time I told anybody about the policy, I was talking with really close friends, and so it felt more comfortable sharing that. For you, if you try it, I would start by trying it with friends who you feel comfortable sharing with. But also realize that by sharing that you have this policy, you're also leveling up the conversation. Instead of it just staying at this surface level of, okay, we're going to talk about these topics, now you're talking about your personal sort of motivations. And that by itself will create either a connection or it will kind of repel people. And that will actually help identify who to continue talking with and who to continue relationships and friendships with. Because I believe that you can actually be friends with pretty much most people. But I also believe that the reality of life is that some people are way easier to make friends with. So if you find that somebody likes talking about the news and that's part of their identity, I believe you can become friends with them and you can have an ongoing relationship with them, but it is going to be harder. So by finding people that you can actively, I was going to say weed out probably isn't the right word, but if it's a big part of their identity, you'll start to realize that, okay, maybe this person isn't the person that I'm going to have the most fun hanging out with. And so especially in the beginning when you're making friends, reach out to people that you enjoy hanging out with and you enjoy having these conversations with. Don't start with the people who it's difficult to have conversations with, the people who only talk about the items in your Antitopics policy. Try it out. Let me know how it goes. I'd love to hear some suggestions or ideas in the comments. If you're like, hey, this is a terrible idea, only say that if you've tried it out a couple times. As always, I talk about all of this stuff more in detail on howtobestfriend.com. I help busy adults make friends they actually enjoy. If you're interested in more videos about that, please subscribe, hit the like button. You know all the cool stuff that you can do to help out the channel. That's all I got for now. Take care.